History as it happens, May 3rd, 2022. The Looming Conflict.
The government of Iran must recognize the gravity of the situation which it has itself created.
Without Iran's cooperation, we cannot bring an end to the Persian Gulf War. Without Iran's concurrence, there can be no enduring peace in the Middle East.
Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom.
My administration is now committed to diplomacy that addresses the full range of issues before us and to pursuing constructive ties among the United States, Iran, and the international community.
Since 1979, the U.S. and Iran have had no formal diplomatic ties, the relationship marked by distrust and hostility. Today, 4 years after Donald Trump pulled the U.S. out of a historic nuclear deal, the Biden administration's efforts to revive it are on the brink of collapse, potentially leading to a new era of mutual suspicion, animosity, and even outright conflict. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The United States, together with our international partners, has achieved something that decades of animosity has not. A comprehensive long-term deal with Iran that will prevent it from obtaining a nuclear weapon.
No action taken by the regime has been more dangerous than its pursuit of nuclear weapons and the means of delivering them.
It was a very fascinating interview with a senior Israeli official in last April, in an Israeli paper, in which they were challenged and said, don't you think Netanyahu's decision to convince Trump to pull out of the deal was a mistake? Because look how far the Iranians have now come with a nuclear program. We're in a much worse situation from a nuclear standpoint than before. And the answer was, yes, some of those developments are bad, but also keep in mind, if Trump had not pulled out of the deal, this Israeli official said, Iran would no longer be on the agenda.
On July 14th, 2015, in the seventh year of his presidency, Barack Obama delivered historic news. U.S. and Iranian negotiators reached an agreement that would prevent Iran from building a nuclear bomb in exchange for sanctions relief. And the president confidently stated something that, through no fault of his own, hasn't aged well.
And I have no doubt that 10 or 15 years from now, the person who holds this office will be in a far stronger position, with Iran further away from a weapon, and with the inspections and transparency that allow us to monitor the Iranian program.
Well, because of President Trump's move to pull the U.S. out of that deal, Iran is now much closer to having enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear weapon than it was before. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If these are the facts, and they are, where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here.
That was Benjamin Netanyahu, arch-enemy of the nuclear deal, showing the UN his bomb cartoon with his red Sharpie way back in 2012. So the Biden administration is now trying to revive the deal, but it is not going well. And I hardly have to remind you, the world, the set of circumstances today is a lot different. The Western world's attention is fixated on Ukraine. Talk of using nuclear weapons is in the air on the Russian side. And the problems of the greater Middle East seem less urgent now than they did when Netanyahu was delivering one of his many warnings, when the U.S. was trying to extract itself from Afghanistan and Iraq. But the problem of Iran's nuclear program hasn't gone away. Indeed, if negotiators can't revive the deal, some experts are concerned the U.S. and Iran could slide toward conflict. Historian John Ghazvinian is the executive director of the Middle East Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and he is the author of America and Iran, A History, 1720 to the Present. And Trita Parsi is the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations and the geopolitics of the Middle East. John Ghazvinian, welcome back to the podcast, your fourth time.
Thank you very much for having me back.
And Trita Parsi, we welcome you for the first time. Hello.
Thank you so much for having me.
So here we are in early May, keeping in mind that some of our listeners may not get to this episode for days or weeks after it is published. Trita, I will begin with you. What is holding up the revival, if you will, of the 2015 nuclear accord?
Well, all of the demands from the American side have now been met, actually already more than a month ago, have been settled. The US doesn't have any additional demands. What is remaining is two demands from the Iranian side. One is that they still insist on some form of assurances that the United States will actually stick to the deal this time around, that it will not pull out of the deal in the manner that it did under Trump. It's unclear whether the Iranians actually expect to get anything on that one, or if it's just something they're throwing out to later on compromise on. The other one is the one that seems to be more serious and that has really caused things to get stuck. And that is that in 2019, Donald Trump put the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is part of the Iranian military, on the terrorist list, on an additional terrorist list. They were already on one list from 2007. This was done very clearly and openly in order to make sure that any return to the JCPOA would be as difficult as possible, as politically costly as possible. And the Iranians mean that this needs to be undone because as long as they are on the terrorist list, it will have an impact on how effective the other sanctions relief will be, and to the extent that European and other companies will go back to Iran.
And you said JCPOA, that is shorthand for the nuclear deal.
So far, the Biden administration has refused. There's been a couple of proposals back and forth, but the answer from the US side has been no. Mainly, this seems to be the case because of a fear in the White House that if they do lift the IRGC off of the terrorists, even though they themselves have clearly said that this is something that was done by Trump to create this type of a problem, even though they themselves have gone out and said that it's been counterproductive because attacks by the IRGC actually increased 400% after this decision was made by Trump. And even though they have also pointed out that during the period in which the US was a part of the JCPOA, there were no attacks by Iraqi militias or the IRGC on US troops in Iraq. Despite all of this, they feel that politically it will be too costly for them to do so. They fear that they will lose votes in the Senate. And now the ball seems to be back in the Iranian court. The Europeans are going to go back to the Iranians and see if the Iranians are willing to drop this demand. And it seems quite unlikely that they will.
So as far as getting assurances that the U.S. won't pull out of the deal again, well, that's impossible because no one knows who's going to win the presidential election in 2024. As far as placing the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps on the FTO, Foreign Terrorist Organization list, I think we all understand when a group is placed on that list, it has as much to do with domestic politics as any real threat of terrorism. So, John Ghazvinian, as you know, I like to get to the fundamentals here on the podcast. You're the historian. When was the IRGC formed and what has been its historic role?
Right. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, grew out of the emotional and heady days immediately following the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The regular Iranian military had a lot of officers that were still loyal to the previous regime, to the Shah's regime, many of whom had defected or left the country. It was a traditional kind of army, the Artesh. The very sort of hot-headed revolutionaries that were around the Ayatollah Khomeini at the time felt that it was important to take a lot of the militants that were very loyal to the Ayatollah and actually organize them in some meaningful way. A lot of them were doing a lot of freelance militia activity anyway on the streets of Iran. That was actually of concern to the provisional government at the time that was led by Mehdi Bazargan, which was more of a kind of moderate, pragmatic, technocratic government that didn't like the fact that there were all these freelance militias out there kind of doing their own thing and felt that they needed to be brought under the auspices of the military. And the compromise measure was that, yes, they would be formalized, but that they would be seen as a kind of revolutionary guard corps, immediately loyal to the principles of the revolution and to the Ayatollah. Where they really started to solidify themselves was during the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, when they were seen fighting heroically, in many ways. This is perhaps an unfair description, but in many ways, the public perception was that they were fighting somehow more heroically than the regular army, the Artesh, which tended to follow traditional, you could even say sort of Western-style military tactics and was more reliant on heavy equipment and material, whereas the IRGC, these were the guys who were out there on the battlefields, running onto minefields and offering themselves up in the trenches. They came to have a really heroic reputation in Iran and were formalized more and more through the 1980s. And then after the war was over, since the 90s, they've really entrenched themselves into many, many different areas of Iranian life. There's no American equivalent, but in some ways they've come to fulfill areas that are in the US are sometimes fulfilled by things like the US Army Corps of Engineers or the Defense Department, where they're involved in contracts and building work and infrastructure and things like that. They're now implicated deeply into almost every aspect of Iranian life.
I think one parallel that is obviously imperfect, but does help shed some light on it, is that it's gone through a few transformations. And what we have seen in the last 20 years is what some have called the Israelization of Iranian politics, in the sense that in Israel right now, if you want to make a political career, you need to start it off in the Israeli Defense Forces. If you want to make a major economic career as well, get on one of these boards, having served in the military, not just in the 2 years that all Israelis have to, but beyond that, is a significant boost to your career. In the case of Iran, it seems to follow a similar pattern, but for different reasons. It's not because of the same competition, but because if you're part of the IRGC, you're part of a network. And that network is very, very powerful. They have now economic power tremendously, and they have a lot of political clout as well. And this is part of the reason why a lot of folks view them as being in charge of the country way beyond what seems to be the case if you just look at it on paper.
So you both are free to answer this next question, but Trita, I'll ask it to you first. Is the IRGC involved in terrorism now? Has it been involved in terrorist activities?
It depends on how you define it. It seems like the definition that is being used by those who favor it being put on the terrorist list is that they have attacked U.S. forces. And they certainly have. There's clear evidence that they have either helped attack U.S. forces by providing weaponry and training to Iraqi militias who have been extensively attacking U.S. forces, and also some cases in which they have directly done so, following, for instance, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, the shooting down of an American drone as well, which I believe was done by the IRGC. If it follows the more narrow definition that you're actually targeting civilians for political reasons and for the purpose of instilling terror, then I think there's no doubt that Iran as a whole has been involved in acts of terrorism, particularly in the 1980s, and that IRGC itself was part of that as well. The difference, though, is this is part of the national army of Iran, and we don't have any other cases in which the United States actually puts an element of a national army of another country on the terrorist list. So that is a completely new development. The question is, what exactly does this specific listing do that Trump did, mindful of the fact that they were already on a previous list since 2007? And the only thing it appears to do is to make it a little bit more difficult for folks who have been in the IRGC to travel. And mindful of the fact that, again, this is part of the conscripted army of another country. Does that in any way, shape, or form enhance U.S. security? Well, according to the Biden administration, it does not, because they themselves have said that this decision led to a 400% increase in attacks by the IRGC.
John Ghazvinian, you were discussing the history of this group before. As Trita said, it was involved in terrorism in the 1980s, but what about recently?
Look, again, I mean, the definitions of terrorism is what's at stake here. I mean, the activities of the IRGC in recent years in Iraq are very similar in some ways to the activities of, say, Hezbollah in Lebanon in the early 1980s, which is when Iran first emerged in the United States as a sort of quote unquote state sponsor of terrorism. I suppose the question you have to ask yourself, and this may not be a popular thing to say in Washington, but the question you have to ask yourself is that when you have two foreign nations whose military forces are engaged actively in a third nation under perhaps dubious legal circumstances, and they are attacking each other, is that an act of terrorism? You could certainly make that case, and I think certainly when you are dealing with a country like Iran that we don't like for various reasons, it's easy to throw around words like that. I don't think that when you say the word terrorism to most people, to most Americans, that is the image that would come to mind. What tends to come to mind is someone or a group or a person with a very strong and fanatically held political conviction or religious conviction or ideological conviction of some kind that attacks and sows mayhem and disorder for the sake of drawing attention to their political cause. When you're talking about the military forces of various countries on the terrain of a third country, I mean, you're certainly welcome to throw around terms like that, but I just think that, at a certain point, we do have to ask ourselves what happens as we start to cheapen the impact, the emotional impact of terms like terrorism.
Trita, you have written that if this deal falls through, war could be next or some kind of more aggressive conflict. So, two-part question. What are the benefits, and maybe this is a dumb question, but what are the benefits of returning to the deal, and why do you feel like war could be next if it falls through?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that the circumstances are quite different now compared to 2012. 2012, it was very clear in Obama's mind that if there wasn't a negotiated settlement on the nuclear program that actually put a stop to some of the advances of Iran's program, then the United States would be forced to take military action. The political circumstances in the country, a situation in which the anti-war sentiments of the American public had not quite gotten as strong as they did years later, made that a political necessity in the minds of the Obama administration. Today, I think it's quite different. There is a sense in Iran that the United States cannot afford a war, and as a result, they don't take it as seriously. There is clearly a sense in Washington that Iran and the nuclear program is not a priority for the administration. In fact, the Iranians are enriching, since April of last year, enriching uranium at 60%. Years ago, if the Iranians had started enriching at 60%, a lot of people in Washington would have said, oh, that would have triggered an American attack. They've been doing it for more than a year now. And we don't see that. So I think, first of all, we do have to recognize the circumstances are a bit different. I do believe, to a certain extent, that the fact that there isn't that sense of a fear of war is part of the reason why also the political will that needs to be mustered to get to a deal is not as strong as it was back in 2012 to 2015. To the core of your questions, what's the benefit? Well, if the deal is restored, it means that the Iranians will ship out all of their low enriched uranium beyond 300 kilos. You need 1,200 kilos of enriched uranium at 3.67% to build a nuclear weapon. You need to re-enrich that to higher and higher levels. The Iranians by now most likely already have 40 kilos of 60% enriched uranium, which means that they have enough material for a bomb. All of that would be shipped out, meaning Iran would not have the fissile material in its own soil to be able to build a bomb. That's critical. That's a key way in which the path to Iran building a nuclear weapon is closed off because they simply don't have the material to do so. Inspections in the program will continue, be beefed up compared to what they are today. That's a critical element because by knowing what's going on in the program, we have all kinds of instruments to make sure that the Iranians are not cheating. If they are, we will find out about it very quickly. Moreover, they will have restrictions to the number of centrifuges they will be using, what kind of centrifuge they will be using. The combination of all of these different things makes it impossible for them to even have the material for the bomb on their own soil. And if they were to make a decision to go in that direction, it would take them, as long as the old deal was in place, 12 months to be able to even get to the point in which they're in today, essentially. All of that would be restored. It would mean that the threat of a potential nuclear weapon in Iran is dramatically reduced, if not completely minimized. To have that achieved in the midst of everything else going on in the world right now, such as the war in Ukraine, is no small feat, and it's no small benefit to the United States security. It's a massive benefit to the U.S. security.
So as my loyal listeners know, John Ghazvinian has been on the podcast several times, and he has explained this ambiguity that Iran prefers. Trita, as I listened to your answer, I was thinking about this. What's perplexing to me is that Iran doesn't really want to go all the way to a bomb. It wants to remain in this kind of ambiguous territory where it has the capability. Is that still the case in your view, John?
So this is actually very interesting. And yes, I know we've talked a lot about this before. My answer might surprise you a bit. I don't know how much longer that's going to be the case. I think as long as the supreme leader is alive, that is going to be the case. He's quite old. There are rumors about his health. And I don't know what comes after the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, because he has absolutely been adamant that there should be no discussion of Iran exiting the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or doing what North Korea did in 2004, which is to say, you know what, the hell with it. You're going to push us this much. We are just going to exit the NPT and we're going to just build a bomb because that's the way to advance our security. There are some hardline voices in Iran who very, very quietly have been suggesting that. And every time they do, they get crushed. They get told that is an absolute non-starter. It's become strangely one of the red lines of Iranian politics in recent years. Traditionally, the red lines are things you couldn't say without getting in trouble, where any kind of criticism of the Supreme Leader or the Islamic Republic or advocating for better relations with the United States or Israel or anything like that. Added to that recently has been any kind of suggestion of exiting the NPT and actually deciding to say, the hell with it, let's just build a bomb. A couple of people who have recently hinted at that have been basically told to be quiet. Now, I don't know what will happen when the Supreme Leader is gone. And the reason I say that is because I think over time, Iran has come to the conclusion, I think for a long time, 20, 30 years now, Iran has had no desire for an actual bomb for reasons we've talked about before. It's not worth it to Iran. It's actually more trouble than it's worth. It invites military intervention and potentially regime change. I mean, it's not like Iran is going to use a nuclear weapon anytime soon. Similarly, as I've said, for Iran to completely capitulate and dismantle its nuclear program and go to zero enrichment and be reliant on foreign nations for its energy needs is also a non-starter, because that also weakens and puts Iran in a position of potential regime change. So for Iran, the happy medium has always been to maintain this ambiguity, this kind of nuclear capability, to be a sort of screwdriver's turn away from a bomb if it needed to be, which is exactly where they are today now. And they've achieved that, as Trita says very correctly. And they've now reached a point of enrichment and capability that 10 years ago would have been completely unacceptable in Washington. It just happened quietly and slowly, despite our so-called concerns about Iran's nuclear program. So for Iran, traditionally, the middle ground, the happy medium has always been to sort of exist in a place where they have nuclear capability and get taken seriously, and that buys them a certain level of influence and sway in the region without going all the way to the bomb. However, and I've maintained that line for a long time, but however, I actually think that we may find ourselves in the next few years in a situation with a new leadership in Iran, potentially drawn more from the Revolutionary Guards, that feels differently, that feels like, you know what, enough is enough. We've played this game, done it the legal way for long enough, and it gets us nowhere, and maybe a situation has changed.
Trita Parsi, do you agree with him? And returning to part two of my other question to you, why do you think a war could happen if the deal falls through?
I do strongly agree with John, and I share his concern and his analysis that what clearly was a strong preference in the past, that they didn't want to cross that threshold, and there's sane strategic reasons for them not wanting to do so. The environment has changed. You mentioned earlier on that, the U.S. cannot give assurance of what will happen with the next president. I'm not so sure it's that simple, to be frank with you. I mean, I think it's paragraph 3 of the JCPOA that says that Iran forswears nuclear weapons forever. So on their end, they're making an eternal promise, and we cannot even make a promise stronger than 2 years. That's not to say that Biden can promise what the next president will do, but there are mechanisms in the JCPOA that made sure that it would be costly for the Iranians to cheat, that would be costly for the Iranians to leave the agreement. The key thing there is the snapback, an entirely new legal invention in the Security Council, in which we managed to convince the Russians and the Chinese to give up their veto, that if one single country of the P5+1 or a party to the JCPOA says that Iran has violated the agreement, within 30 days, all of the old UN sanctions will be put back in place, and Russia and China could not veto it. This was done because of an argument that unless it was clear and swift, the Iranians may have incentives to cheat, knowing that it would take perhaps a full year before the UN Security Council would actually take action. So we put that in place. We convinced the Russians and the Chinese, and the Iranians had to accept it. There is no such mechanism that prevents the United States from leaving it. In fact, when the US left the agreement under Trump, every other country paid a cost, including the Europeans, who lost massive investments and deals. The only country that didn't pay anything was the United States. That asymmetric situation, I think, is dangerous for the long-term security of the deal as a whole. But the Biden administration has had no interest in dealing with this. Going to the second half of your question, I think the risk of war is there, but in a somewhat different way than before. I think there's going to be some political pressures on the administration that they have to do something if the JCPOA collapses and the Iranians accelerate their program. And they perhaps go beyond 60%, they go all the way to 90%, which is weapons-grade uranium. And then the United States may go back to the UN and may do exactly what I said regarding snap back the sanctions on Iran. The Iranians, under those circumstances, say that they've already made a decision. If the US snapbacks, or if the Europeans or the US snapback sanctions at the UN, the Iranians will walk out of the NPT. Forget about the JCPOA. They will leave the NPT altogether. That means that all inspections in Iran will end. We will know nothing of what's going on in the Iranian program. For the first couple of months, we may be guessing how close they are to having a bomb. But after a while, because of not knowing, the question will be, do they already have one? At that point, the US will likely either take military action or it will take measures to hurt the Iranians economically. And there's not a lot of sanctions left you can put on Iran. So one of the things the administration likely will do is to go after Iranian oil tankers in the high seas. The Iranians currently have about 25 million barrels of oil just sitting on the seas in tankers. They've pumped up the oil, but they can't sell it. Obviously, they're probably selling it faster right now than before. But instead of stopping to pump the oil, because that could damage the oil wells, they kept on pumping, but they put them on tankers until they could find a buyer. The US has already confiscated 2 of these tankers, taken the oil, sold it, and kept the money. If the US does this with the rest of the oil that Iran has on the seas, it may not be able to get to all of them, but if it gets to half of them, we're talking about $1 to $2 billion. At that point, I find it quite likely that the Iranians will start either themselves or through Iraqi militias attack US forces in Iraq. And the Biden administration has already made clear that they view that as an act of war. So I can see ways in which we will be slipping in, not directly, not in 1 or 2 steps, but in a series of steps into an escalation that leads to a military confrontation that I'm convinced, A, neither side wants, and B, neither side thinks is likely, but it may actually be much more likely than they think.
Can I ask a question, Trita? Actually, do you foresee a situation a little bit like the tanker war of the late 1980s?
In the sense that there would be attacks on the tankers?
I mean, what you're describing, yeah, I mean, and Iranians retaliating with things like, sea mines, and I mean, and obviously in this case, militias in Iraq as well. I mean, sort of low grade, almost kind of managed conflict that goes on for a couple of years, just a slightly more heated up version of what we've been seeing for the last few years.
Unfortunately, you can't rule it out. I would say one thing, though. What the U.S. really wants at this point is more oil on the market. So doing anything to actually push out Iranian oil would be counterproductive to the U.S. The Iranians can hurt the U.S. a lot by mining the Persian Gulf, doing things like this that would push up oil prices even further. They're going to be able to sell more oil because the prices are high, demand is high, and they're going to find buyers. If that happens, then there's likely going to be retaliation. And where is the discipline? Where is the exit ramps? Where do you make sure that you say, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to do this any further. We're not going to allow further escalation. Keep in mind, for the last year and a half now, the Iranians and the US haven't talked to each other directly at all. Everything has been through the Europeans. That in of itself is a very dangerous situation. And that's mostly the fault of the Iranians. They're the ones who've refused to engage directly with the US until the US rejoined the JCPOA.
So, John Ghazvinian, here we are again, where both sides are producing a self-fulfilling prophecy again, where Iran is moving closer to either building a bomb or having the capability to build a bomb. This happened under the George W. Bush administration. Iran went from having hundreds of centrifuges to thousands. What's your take on that? What's happening right now, based on Trita's answer?
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt that this was a completely unnecessary, self-fulfilling, cyclical kind of crisis, and one that could have been easily avoided with a different kind of atmosphere and dynamic in the conversation between Iran and the United States. It's as simple as that. You can get very lost in the weeds and the details and the technicalities of these things, but at the end of the day, it's very easy to look at it this way, which is that something as complex as a nuclear program and the nuclear standoff and all of this stuff that we're talking about, is not something you can resolve between two parties that fundamentally don't trust each other and don't like each other. It's almost impossible. It's going to break down. I mean, you can create all the mechanisms you want, and I agree with Trita, we should create some more of them, because one of the things we created mechanisms to make sure Iran wouldn't cheat, but we never considered the fact that the United States might decide to pull out. But, you know, at the end of the day, all these things are never really going to work well when you have an atmosphere of such deep distrust. And conversely, if you have an atmosphere of goodwill and trust and positive diplomacy, actually, this nuclear issue is very easy to resolve, because it's not actually the core of the disagreement between the United States and Iran. It's sort of become a proxy, like a stand-in for US-Iran hostility. The reason this became such a big deal fundamentally is because Barack Obama came to power in January 2009 and said that he wanted a fundamentally different kind of relationship with Iran.
So on the occasion of your new year, I want you, the people and leaders of Iran, to understand the future that we seek. It's a future with renewed exchanges among our people and greater opportunities for partnership and commerce.
That made all of the sort of usual voices in Washington and in the region, whether it's the Israelis or the Emiratis or the Saudis or the large constituency of domestic opposition to US-Iran relations in Washington, come out and say, well, no, what about their nuclear program? Obama's feeling was, well, okay, let's just try to address that as quickly as we can so that we can move on to a deeper and better relationship with Iran. Little did he expect, though, just how strong this opposition was and how successfully the Israelis and others would drag out the issue throughout both of his terms politically, to the point where it sort of became the only issue between the US and Iran, as if this is all you have to solve and this is the big problem. I don't know that this was ever the big problem between the US and Iran, actually.
Yeah. Iran's never had a bomb.
Right. And I still don't know that it actually is when you step away from it all. But it's become the standard thing. It's become like you can't do anything until you resolve the JCPOA. Now, it's almost become so ossified, so solidified. It reminds me in some ways of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the so-called peace process that became a sort of process of its own with no real end in sight. But the difference is that at least with the Arab-Israeli conflict, there was an actual conflict beforehand. This whole issue of the nuclear, I mean, it was one of a number of grievances that the United States had about Iran, but it wasn't the only one. And it still won't be the only one if it gets resolved. That, I think, is a shame. And I think this is, it's been 20 years of just manufacturing and spinning and creating a self-fulfilling problem that actually could have been resolved in a very different kind of atmosphere.
And at times when the hardliners in Iran were ascendant or in power, those times coincided with more flexible regimes in Washington and vice versa. When you had hardliners in Washington, you had reformers in Iran. We've never really had, how should I put it, people willing to speak on both sides, right, at the same time, with the possible exception of the Obama administration. And I'm not even sure I know what the Biden administration's policy is toward Iran. It's not regime change, but what is it? That was a lot of words there, but go ahead.
I don't know that I don't know that they have one. And I mean, I don't know, Trita may have, being seated where he is in Washington, may have more complex insight into this. But I think the point you're making about, you're right. The only time that has not been the case has been in the early Obama years, where you actually did have two governments that did seem to kind of actually want to achieve some sort of understanding. But I think what we saw during that time was just how entrenched certain political forces are on all sides in opposition to warmer US-Iran relations. And yet, despite all of that, it was done, proving that it can be done. But anyway, that's...
Trita?
Yeah, I think your characterization is correct that, there's always been this mismatch, but the stars aligned during the Rouhani and the Obama administration, and we saw that something positive could come out of it. What I fear about this time around, and going back to your question, what does the Obama administration want? I think the Obama administration does want a deal.
Biden administration.
That's not the question. Sorry, the Biden administration. I think the question is not whether they want it or not. The question is, do they want it enough? Do they want it badly enough? Because the pattern of how they have conducted this is that they're trying to constantly minimize any political cost. They're trying to get it without having to pay a price. And it's just not possible for the United States and Iran to strike a deal, painful compromise, without paying a political price at home. So when Biden came in, I think the big mistake was that he could have just gone back into the deal day one, week one, through an executive order, just as he did on day one with Paris, with WHO, no negotiations. And whatever problems would remain, and there would be some problems without a doubt that would have to be dealt with, but it would be dealt with in two ways that would be far superior and better for the US than what we're facing now with a negotiated strategy that it chose. First of all, the US would be back in the deal, and as a result would have the moral authority of having returned to the deal. Secondly, the worst things with Iran's nuclear program that we have to deal with today all came during the period that Biden was president because he chose to negotiate a return. Once it became clear to the Iranians that the US was going to negotiate its way back, because of their suspicion and paranoia, they didn't think that Biden wanted to just negotiate back and everything will be fine. They thought that Biden was going to delay this process and try to keep the Trump sanctions, which are still there till to this day, to weaken Iran as much as possible. And if it's going to be a negotiated return, well, then the Iranians need leverage for their negotiations. They need bargaining chips. So what did they do? They started to aggressively expand the program, including enriching all the way up to 60%, something that they hadn't even done under Trump. So a lot of the problems we're dealing with today actually came as a result of that decision. If we had just gone back in, there would have been some headaches and problems, but we would at least not be dealing with the fact that the Iranian breakout capability has gone from 1 year to essentially 0 to 1 week as a result of this, in my view, highly, highly unwise decision.
John and I spent an entire episode some months ago, actually it was already last year, discussing Benjamin Netanyahu's role in this historical saga. He's out of the picture now, but Israel's policy hasn't changed. Is Israel serving any role, productive or otherwise, in this current negotiation?
They certainly are a major factor. I think it's different from what it was under Netanyahu. Under Netanyahu, he took great pleasure in attacking the Obama administration very publicly. He took unprecedented steps in the sense of speaking, addressing Congress against the sitting president of the United States, had never done before.
Don't forget the cartoon bomb either.
Well, let me show you. Brought a diagram for you. Here's a diagram. This is a bomb. This is a fuse.
And the cartoon bomb at the UN, all of the theatrics that he put in, and that raised the political cost for Obama. It ended up becoming a very, very brutal fight in the summer of 2015. And that's part of the thing that the Biden team want to avoid. The question is, can you really avoid it? At some point, you have to ask yourself, do you want a nuclear deal or not? Part of the reason why the Biden administration delayed any return and wanted to negotiate it is because the Israelis back then was telling them, don't rush back into the deal, don't rush back into the deal. The Biden administration spent the first couple of weeks and months negotiating with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, trying to make sure that they would be okay with an American return. First of all, that's an American decision. And secondly, on what basis did they think that they would be successful in that endeavor? I can tell you that at one point, Tony Blinken was in Israel while Netanyahu was still prime minister, and they were trying to convince him to not oppose the JCPOA talks as much. And they agreed that during the press conference, they would not address the JCPOA. They would try to stay clear of that. Press conference starts. No one asks a question about the JCPOA. Instead, Netanyahu himself starts talking about it and blasts the Biden administration for doing so. So it was very clear. There was no way the Biden administration was going to win that. They were not going to be able to change Netanyahu's perceptions. With Bennett, it's different. Bennett is still creating problems, opposing the deal, but he's not doing it in a way that is creating as much problem for the administration. It's not a head-on fight. It's not an open fight between the two leaders. They continue to talk. They continue to issue all of these statements about how much they support each other, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kept in check, but the actual position has not changed dramatically. And in fact, the biggest obstacle, as I'm hearing it, to the administration lifting IRGC delisting is because of the objections from Israel and the problems they certainly can cause on Capitol Hill if Biden goes ahead with that decision.
I think what's really important for your listeners to take away from this, it's so interesting, and I think it's so easy to miss, right, is that in 2009, when both Obama and Netanyahu both came to power around the same time, And Obama made it clear he wanted to improve relations with Iran. Everything you heard from Israel and from its friends was, there's no time. We're in a rush. Iran is months away from a bomb. There just isn't time. You have maybe a few months for these negotiations, but then you have to decide that they're not going to work out, and you have to move to more severe restrictions and sanctions and so on. There isn't time for all these negotiations. And that changed the tenor of the first Obama administration from 2009 to 2012, when they just kept adding sanctions and pressure on Iran and didn't get anywhere with the negotiations because they were so concerned with the Israelis telling them that it just isn't the time for this. We don't have the luxury of this. From the very moment Obama was reelected in 2013, I would argue until today, still, the Israeli line shifted 180 degrees in the other direction. And it's become, what's the rush? What's the rush? Let's do this right. Better to have a no deal than to have a bad deal. That should tell you something. The concern of the Israelis, as I've always argued, has not been that the Iranians are about to build a nuclear weapon and fire it off in the direction of Tel Aviv. That's not something they're scared of, because they know that there's absolutely no chance of that whatsoever. What they're concerned about is the idea of better relations between the United States and Iran. And when Obama made it clear that that was what his intention was in 2009, suddenly there was this urgency around the nuclear stuff. And as soon as Obama was reelected and they had much less leverage, suddenly it was a different story. And when they saw that Obama was going to go ahead and do the deal anyway, with or without them, and just ignore them because he had the luxury of being in his second term, it was a completely different story. Suddenly it was, don't take your time. I mean, let's not rush into anything. That was true of Netanyahu as well as Naftali Bennett. I mean, that's been a change in the Israeli line since 2013.
It was a very fascinating interview with a senior Israeli official in last April, in an Israeli paper, in which they were challenged and said, don't you think Netanyahu's decision to convince Trump to pull out of the deal was a mistake? Because look how far the Iranians have now come with a nuclear program. We're in a much worse situation from a nuclear standpoint than before. And the answer was, yes, some of those developments are bad, but also keep in mind, if Trump had not pulled out of the deal, this Israeli official said, Iran would no longer be on the agenda. It's quite an astonishing statement. It was more important to make sure that Iran was on the agenda as a point of conflict between the US and Iran than to actually have a situation in which the nuclear program is kept in check.
And I think in some precincts of American politics, there are some neoconservatives who would want war with Iran, who wouldn't be too upset if Iran did cross a red line, because they want regime change. We know there are these people out there. I do want to talk about the global context now. To John's earlier point about how after the current supreme leader is gone, what might happen with Iran's nuclear program? Might they be willing to finally go all the way? We are operating in a global context now where proliferation is a problem. How is what's going on in Ukraine right now affecting this situation?
I don't have too much to say about this. I mean, I think the only thing that the Ukraine conflict is bringing to sharper relief is that the specter of actual hot nuclear war has not completely disappeared. I mean, for the first time in my living memory, we've actually been worried in recent weeks about the prospect of nuclear war. And this is not very far from Iran or Israel or India or Pakistan or China, all of which have nuclear weapons in addition to Russia. It is a dangerous neighborhood. That reminds us of what the stakes of all of this are. So while we've been arguing vociferously about the notional possibility of Iran building a nuclear weapon for many, many years, we've lost sight of these flashpoints in the region where people actually do have nuclear weapons.
There is a global context here, Trita. We're going in the wrong direction when it comes to proliferation.
Certainly. I mean, we have never been in a situation like this in the last 40 or so years in which a state is openly talking about circumstances in which it would use nuclear weapons. Folks who are following the conversation on Russian TV are extremely alarmed. Commentators there are talking about when nuclear war would be worth it. This is tremendously dangerous. This is going to have an impact on the nuclear talks, I fear, because regardless of whether the United States succeeds in making sure that Russia or Putin suffers a strategic defeat, the conduct of most of the world is such that they believe that the world has already become multipolar. It doesn't matter what happens in Ukraine. It is multipolar. They're not joining the sanctions on Russia, for instance. They vote against it because they believe that what Russia has done is wrong. It's a violation of international law and principles of sovereignty. But they're not joining the sanctions because they believe that multipolarity is already here, unipolarity is gone. That is, I think, one of the biggest changes that have happened in the last 30 years when it comes to how the Iranians will deal with this. Whether you were a hardliner or a moderate in Iran, you still believed for the past 30 years that the path for Iran to get out of its isolation and achieve its longer-term objective of being a major power in the region went through Washington. Now, if you were a moderate, you believed that through negotiations and some sort of accommodation, Washington could be appeased and Washington could come to terms with Iran. If you were a hardliner, you were more skeptical and you believed that Washington would never come to terms with Iran unless it was forced to do so. And you had to play hardball to get to that point. But the path still went through Washington because the United States was the gatekeeper of who is in and who is out of the community of nations. In this multipolar world, however, we may be soon in a situation in which there is either more than one gatekeeper or perhaps no gatekeeper. And that is going to have the most profound impact on how the Iranians calculate whether they need to go through the United States and get a JCPOA, or if they can actually live without having any trade with the US and Europe, et cetera, and go in a different direction. And we already see this in the policies of the Raisi government. Their focus, actually, they're saying that their priority is not the JCPOA. Their priority is regional states, the regional neighbors, trade and better relations with them. I think that was an early indication of the realization that either multipolarity was coming or it was already here.
Final thought. When the U.S. and the Biden administration discusses a rules-based world order, and when you consider U.S. policy toward Iran for decades now and the way the U.S. is handling what's going on in Eastern Europe, when I hear that rules-based order, I feel like the Biden administration is talking to itself. This is a charade. The damage the United States has done to that world order since 9/11, right?
I would argue maybe even before 9/11, but
yes.
Sure, yeah.
Yes, I hardly have to tell two scholars of Iranian history the 1954 coup to topple Mossadegh. But go ahead, John.
I actually think Trita can probably address this question better than I can. He's written very eloquently recently about this exact question and very convincingly about how differently this stuff is playing in different parts of the world. You know, I think there is an incredible unanimity around the world right now about the way people feel about Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but there is not the same level of unanimity about rallying behind the United States necessarily. That's relevant. And I think the other thing about that is the sanctions. These sanctions that are being placed on Russia right now, I don't know that they would have been as effective or as finely honed had they not been practiced and tried out on Iran for the past couple of decades. The United States has perfected its sanctions game on Iran and Venezuela and Syria and other countries as well, but especially Iran. The things like the dollar U-turn and the banning of Iran from SWIFT and things like that would have been unprecedented 10, 15 years ago. And have taken place quietly over the past decade or so because it's Iran and no one really cares. Now they're being imposed on Russia, but you're seeing that people care. Maybe not in the US or in Western Europe, but you do see the Chinese and the Russians think, especially in China. I mean, there's some really serious high-level conversations taking place now about how can we circumvent and sidestep the American stranglehold on the international financial system. They're a long way from being able to do that. But the fact that these conversations are beginning to take place is pretty significant.
Trita, final thoughts on this, what I'll call a make-believe world order, Cold War or post-Cold War mentality of democracy versus autocracy.
Framing it in that manner, which, you know, both the Ukrainians have done, Europeans and the Biden administration officials do, which is to say that this battle is about the future of the international rules-based order. That is, in my view, the fastest way of making sure that the rest of the global South does not join it. As John said, they're totally opposed, I would say, by tremendous margins that what Russia is doing is absolutely wrong, that this is a violation of all kinds of principles and it needs to be condemned. They don't see it particularly different from the invasion of Iraq. In fact, they see it very similar to that. And just as much as they oppose that, they oppose this one. But when it comes to sanctions and other things, they're not in the mood of making major and very painful sacrifices so that the United States and the West can return to the old rules-based order with all of its contradictions and all of its double standards. if we're asking them to make sacrifices, I think their request is, what will the new rules-based order look like? And how will it be different from the past one? Because they're not signing up to sacrifice anything for the past one. And there, I'm not seeing any openness or interest from any side in the West of recognizing that there needs to be a bit of a renegotiation of what that is. And I think another thing that we have missed in all of this is that as much as they oppose what Russia has done, they don't see, by and large, Russia being a threat to them, because Russia has invaded a neighboring country. Its reach to be able to do similar things in Africa or Asia or elsewhere is just not the same. What they have seen, however, through the swiftness of the sanctions, is that the United States in 4 days can cut a country entirely off of the international financial order system. And that's terrifying to friends and enemies of the United States. Even the friends are worried about this, saying, oh my God, mindful of the fact that the US has not particularly dealt with its massive power in a responsible way in the last 25 years. What does it mean to be so dependent on something that the US can cut you off on in 4 days? So what do? Countries do what they always do. They try to find balancing options. So for them, they want to see Putin defeated in Ukraine when it comes to the issue of Ukrainian territory. But they seem to prefer Putin to win against Biden on the matter of unipolarity versus multipolarity. Because in a multipolar world, the big powers will balance and check each other, which means that overall, there will likely be less of the type of interventions and excesses that we have seen in the last 25 years. We may disagree with this perception. We may argue that their analysis is wrong, and it may be wrong. What we're doing right now is that we're not even acknowledging that other countries may have different perceptions on the Russia-Ukraine crisis for reasons that have nothing to do with them being in any way, shape, or form sympathetic to Putin.
Trita Parsi, John Ghazvinian, we thank you for your expertise. And the war in Eastern Europe will be the focus of our next episode of History as It Happens, How to End a War. Right now, there is no real debate in the U.S. over open-ended support for Ukraine, and Russia appears hell-bent on achieving some kind of military victory. But we know that most wars end in settlements, not total wins on the battlefield. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.